Vane Thorn was a man whose very name inspired terror, yet here he was, reduced to a weeping shadow as he watched his children through a digital lens. He wasn't looking for love across the 50 flickering monitors of his high-tech fortress. He was hunting for the inevitable slip, the moment the new maid, Ilara, would finally reveal her true face. The House of Thorn had become a mausoleum of marble and silence, where the only sound was the haunting whir of camera gimbals tracking the movements of two young children who had been broken by a brutal hit. Leo and Mia sat motionless in their wheelchairs, trapped in a nonverbal prison of trauma that no doctor could unlock. Vane's piercing blue eyes, etched with the violence of his underworld empire, remained fixed on the screen as Ilara Voss approached the nursery. He expected her to steal, to lie, or to fail like the 7 before her, but instead, the tension reached a heart-stopping peak. Rather than cleaning, Ilara knelt and placed her hands over the children's hearts, performing a series of complex sensory signals and humming a frequency that instantly silenced their night terrors. Vane's world shattered when he realized this was a secret technique known only to the elite specialist who had supposedly perished saving his family. To begin the expansion of your story, here is the narrative for the first chapter, modeling the depth and emotional intensity of the reference story while utilizing your unique characters and setting. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Vane Thorn built a fortress of glass to protect his children, but it took a maid of shadows to show him that a cage is still a cage. Do you think Vane was right to burn his empire to the ground, or did he leave his children too vulnerable to the ghosts of the past? Let me know your thoughts on Vane's redemption in the comments below. Vane Thorn was a man whose very name inspired terror in the rain-slick streets of the underworld, yet here he was, reduced to a weeping shadow as he watched his children through a digital lens. He didn't look for love across the 50 flickering monitors of his high-tech fortress. He was hunting for the inevitable slip, the moment the new maid, Ilara, would finally reveal her true face. The House of Thorn had become a mausoleum of marble and silence, where the only sound was the haunting whir of camera gimbals tracking the movements of two young children who had been broken by a brutal hit. Leo and Mia sat motionless in their wheelchairs, trapped in a nonverbal prison of trauma that no doctor could unlock. Vane's piercing blue eyes, etched with the violence of his empire, remained fixed on the screen as Ilara Voss approached the nursery. He expected her to steal, to lie, or to fail like the 7 before her. He watched the wreck light pulse like a mechanical heartbeat, a red reminder that in this house, trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. The silence in the manor was heavy, thick with the ghost of a laughter that had died the same night as his wife. Vane remembered the sound of small feet running across these hardwood floors, the chaotic joy that once defined his life before the screech of tires and the smell of ozone changed everything. Now, his children were 4 years old, barely speaking, and barely looking up from the floor. He had spent millions on the best surgeons and the most advanced equipment, but the light in their eyes remained extinguished. His only solution was control. He had built walls, high ones, and filled every corner of their lives with cameras. Every hallway was a corridor of surveillance, every room was a stage where the staff were the actors and he was the judge. He had seen it all, the nurse who tried to photograph his children's medical charts for a rival family, the caregiver who skimmed off their expensive medication, and the one who simply vanished when the weight of the Thorn name became too heavy to bear. When Ilara Voss had walked through the iron gates that morning in March, carrying only one small, weathered suitcase, Vane had felt nothing but a familiar, cold suspicion. She was quiet, too calm for a woman entering a lion's den, and her eyes held a depth of sorrow that mirrored his own, though he refused to acknowledge it. He had handed her the contract without a single word of welcome, viewing her as just another risk, another potential traitor he would eventually have to discard. For 2 weeks, he monitored her every move from the blue-lit sanctuary of his office. He watched her fold the children's clothes with a meticulousness that bordered on reverence. He watched her prepare their meals, arranging the fruit on their plates into small, smiling faces, a detail he found both unnecessary and irritatingly human. He waited for her to pocket a piece of silverware or spend too much time in the restricted wings of the manor, but she never did. She moved through the house of Thorn like a ghost, efficient and invisible. But on this 14th night, the silence of the house was broken. Through the high-fidelity microphones, Vane heard the ragged, gasping sobs of his children. They were trapped in the recurring nightmare of the hit, the darkness of their room filled with the imagined shadows of gunmen. Vane stood frozen in his office, his hand hovering over the intercom, his own heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm of helpless agony. He watched camera 4, the nursery feed, waiting for Alara to do what the others had done, turn on the lights, offer a sterile glass of water, or simply stand there in awkward incompetence. Instead, the screen showed Alara moving through the shadows without turning on a single lamp. She didn't speak, she didn't offer empty platitudes. She knelt on the floor between the two wheelchairs, her silhouette framed by the pale moonlight. Vane leaned closer to the monitor, his breath hitching in his throat. He saw her reach out, her movements fluid and practiced, and place her palms directly over the children's hearts. She began to hum. It wasn't a song he recognized from the radio or a common nursery rhyme. It was a specific, low-frequency vibration that seemed to resonate even through the electronic speakers of the surveillance system. As she hummed, she moved her hands in a series of complex sensory signals, taps and glides that followed a pattern he had seen only once before, in a top-secret medical journal his wife had obsessively studied before the accident. The effect was instantaneous. Leo, who usually shook for hours during these episodes, suddenly went still. Mia's frantic breathing leveled out. The children, who had been nonverbal for a year, didn't scream. Instead, they leaned into her. Vane watched in a state of paralysis as his son, the boy who refused to be touched by anyone, reached out a trembling hand and gripped Alara's sleeve. Vane's coffee mug slipped from his hand, shattering against the marble floor, but he didn't even blink. He fell to his knees, his eyes locked on the woman on the screen. Everything he thought he knew about Alara Voss, the quiet maid, the simple hire, the stranger in his house, was a lie. She was doing the impossible. She was reaching the children he had thought were lost forever. And as the red light of the camera continued to pulse, Vane Thorn realized that the greatest threat to his heart wasn't an assassin at the gate, but the woman currently healing his children in the dark. The heavy marble floor of the security office felt like ice beneath Vane's knees, but he didn't move. His gaze was anchored to monitor 4, where the graininess of the night vision feed made Alara Voss look like a shimmering apparition. On the screen, the impossible was unfolding. Leo and Mia, whose bodies had been locked in a permanent, rigid state of high alert since the night of the red winter hit, were beginning to soften. It was a physical transformation that defied every medical prognosis Vane had received from the world's leading neurologists. Vane reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed the cool surface of the monitor. He traced the outline of Alara's silhouette. Who was she? He had run her fingerprints through every underworld database from Moscow to Macau, and they had come back clean, dangerously clean. In his world, a lack of a record usually meant one of two things: a civilian of no consequence, or a ghost, an operative so highly placed that their existence was scrubbed by state-level agencies. Looking at the way she held his children, Vane began to fear it was the latter. The humming continued, a low, rhythmic thrum that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the manor. It was the mother's frequency. Vane recognized the term now, a half-remembered memory surfacing from the dark depths of his grief. His late wife, Elena, had been obsessed with sensory resonance. She had spent months in Switzerland studying under a specialist who claimed that the human nervous system could be retuned after extreme trauma using specific Hertz levels and tactile pressure points. Elena had practiced it on the children when they were infants to help them sleep, but she had never finished her notes. She had taken the secret of the frequency to her grave. And yet, here was a maid, a woman hired for £300 a week to scrub floors and fold linens, utilizing the exact sequence. Vane stood up slowly, his joints popping in the silence of the room. He felt a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline. If she knew the frequency, she knew Elena. If she knew Elena, she was part of the hit. His mind, warped by years of betrayal and the constant threat of assassination, immediately defaulted to the darkest possible conclusion. He began to pace the narrow confines of the security suite, the blue light of the monitors casting long, distorted shadows against the soundproofed walls. 7 caregivers had preceded Ilara. Each one had been a calculated risk, and each one had proven Vane's cynicism correct. There was the nurse from the London clinic who had been caught trying to plant a GPS tracker in Leo's wheelchair, likely working for the Moretti family. There was the quiet, elderly woman who had been found stealing Mia's sedative medication, presumably to sell it on the black market. Every time Vane opened his doors, the world sent him a snake. He looked back at the screen. Ilara was now whispering. The microphone struggled to pick up the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a lullaby, but the lyrics weren't in English. They were in a dialect he couldn't quite place, something old, something that felt like it belonged to a different life. "You're okay," the audio feed crackled as she spoke. "The shadows are just memories, and memories can't hurt you anymore. I promised her. I promised I'd find you." Vane froze. "I promised her." The air in the office suddenly felt too thin to breathe. He turned away from the monitors and walked to the heavy mahogany desk at the center of the room. He pulled open the bottom drawer and withdrew a thick, leather-bound file, the dossier on the Red Winter incident. It was a collection of police reports, crime scene photos, and hospital intake forms that he had memorized until the details were burned into his retinas. He flipped through the pages until he reached the witness statements from the night of the crash. The hit had been precise, a high-speed pit maneuver on the M25, followed by a spray of suppressed gunfire. Elena had died instantly. The children had survived only because a first responder had arrived within seconds, allegedly a passing ambulance that hadn't even been dispatched yet. The report mentioned a female paramedic who had performed an emergency field procedure to stabilize Leo's collapsed lung while under active fire from the retreating Moretti gunman. The name in the report was redacted for security reasons. Vane's eyes shifted to the small, weathered suitcase Ilara had brought with her. It was currently sitting in the staff quarters on the 3rd floor. He looked at the clock, 3:14 a.m. Ilara was still in the nursery, her head bowed in prayer or exhaustion as the twins finally drifted into a deep, natural sleep, the first they had had in 3 years without the aid of chemical suppressants. Vane left the security office, his footsteps heavy and purposeful on the marble stairs. He didn't turn on the lights. He moved through the manor like a predator in his own territory, guided by the dim glow of the emergency exit signs. When he reached the staff wing, he paused outside Ilara's door. His heart was a drum in his chest, a mix of cold fury and a desperate, terrifying hope he didn't want to admit to. He pushed the door open. The room was sparsely furnished, smelling faintly of lavender and old paper. He didn't hesitate. He went straight for the suitcase. It wasn't locked. Inside, he found exactly what he expected from a woman of her station: 3 sets of modest clothes, a Bible with a worn spine, and a small toiletry kit. But tucked into the lining of the suitcase was something else. A hidden pocket. Vane reached inside and pulled out a single photograph, protected by a plastic sleeve. He held it up to the moonlight filtering through the window. It was a picture of a younger woman in a tactical paramedic uniform. She was kneeling in the mud of a motorway shoulder, her face smeared with blood and soot. Behind her, the wreckage of a black SUV was engulfed in flames, the SUV that had carried Vane's world. He turned the photo over. On the back, in a cramped, hurried hand, were the words, September 17th. The night I failed my daughter, but saved his. Rachel's last breath was a prayer. I will keep it. The photograph slipped from Vane's hand, fluttering to the rug. The Red Winter hit hadn't just taken his wife, it had taken someone else's child. He realized then that Ilara wasn't a maid, and she wasn't a spy. She was the ghost from the motorway. She was the woman who had pulled his children from the burning steel while his world turned to ash. Down the hall, he heard the soft creak of floorboards. Ilara was returning from the nursery. Vane didn't move. He stood in the center of her small, dark room, the evidence of her sacrifice lying at his feet. He realized that for 2 weeks, he had been watching her through 50 cameras, looking for a betrayal that didn't exist, while she had been carrying a burden of grief and loyalty that he couldn't even fathom. He had treated her like a criminal, and she had treated his children like a sacred vow. The door opened. Elara stood in the threshold, her silhouette thin and weary. She saw him immediately. She didn't scream. She didn't look surprised. She simply looked at the photograph on the floor, and then up at Vane's piercing blue eyes, which were now wet with a realization that threatened to break his iron resolve. "You weren't supposed to find that yet," she said, her voice a mere whisper in the dark. "Who are you?" Vane asked, his voice cracking. "I'm the woman who promised your wife that your children wouldn't die alone," she replied. "And I'm the woman you're going to try to fire tomorrow because you're too afraid to believe I'm real." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Vane had ever heard. In that moment, the high-tech fortress of the Thorn Manor felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage, one he had built for himself, and one Elara Voss had just unlocked. Vane stood in the center of the room, the single photograph of the Red Winter crash feeling like a brand in his hand. The silence between him and Elara was not the empty silence of his manor, but a pressurized space filled with 3 years of unspoken grief and hidden debt. He looked from the blood-stained image of the motorway to the woman standing in the doorway. She looked smaller than she had on his high-definition monitors, more fragile, yet possessed of a terrifyingly calm resolve. "Why didn't you tell me?" Vane's voice was a low rasp, the sound of a man who had forgotten how to speak without command. "You let me treat you like a common thief. You let me watch you on those cameras for 14 days, waiting for you to fail." Elara stepped further into the room, not bothering to turn on the light. She preferred the shadows, they were familiar territory. Because Vane Thorn doesn't take gifts. He takes territory. He takes loyalty by force. If I had walked up to your gates and told you I was the one who pulled your children from the fire, you wouldn't have seen a savior. You would have seen a debt you couldn't pay, or a witness you needed to silence. She walked over and gently took the photograph from his hand. Her fingers were cold, but her touch was steady. "I didn't come here for your gratitude, Vane. I came because I made a promise to a woman who was dying in my arms. Rachel didn't ask for a billionaire to protect them. She asked for someone to love them. You've provided the fortress, but you've let the home go cold." Vane felt a flash of his trademark fury, the defensive mechanism that had kept him alive in the underworld for a decade. "I have provided everything. The best surgeons, the mechanical braces, the 24-hour security. And yet they haven't spoken a word in 3 years," Elara countered, her voice rising for the first time. "They don't need sensors and steel, Vane. They need to know the world isn't a monster waiting to eat them. You watch them through a lens because you're afraid to look them in the eye and see your own failure. You're not protecting them from the Moretus anymore, you're protecting yourself from the pain of losing them again." Vane flinched as if she'd struck him. He looked at the suitcase, the sparse belongings, and the Bible. The report said the paramedic on the scene vanished. The official record says she died of her injuries 6 months later. Elara's gaze dropped to her own midsection, to the place where a stray bullet from the retreating gunman had torn through her tactical vest and into her womb. "Elara Voss died on paper because the agency I worked for couldn't have a witness to a failed protection detail. And physically. I lost the ability to ever have children of my own that night. While I was holding Leo's lungs together, I was losing my own daughter. So you see, Vane, we are the same. We both left pieces of ourselves on that motorway. The difference is, I'm trying to get mine back through them." The revelation hit Vane with the force of a physical blow. He had spent years mourning his wife, but he had never considered the collateral damage of his life. This woman had lost her future to save his legacy, and he had spent the last fortnight hoping to catch her stealing silver. "The 47,000 pounds, Vane said, his mind racing through the financial anomalies he'd found in the twins' trust fund. The anonymous donations for the hydrotherapy pool. That was you. Every cent of my disability payout, she admitted. It didn't belong to me. It belonged to the children who paid the price for my presence that night. Vane turned toward the window, looking out over the sprawling, dark grounds of the manor. The 50 cameras were out there, humming in the night, silent sentinels of his paranoia. For the first time, the sight of them nauseated him. He had built a world of glass and electronics, believing that if he could see everything, he could control everything. But he had been blind to the only thing that mattered. I'm going to find the men who did this, Elara, Vane whispered, the cold kingpin returning to his tone. I will burn every house they own until there is nothing left but ash. And while you're out burning the world, Elara said softly, moving toward the door, who is going to stay here and teach your children how to live in it? You can't kill your way to a family, Vane. You can only love your way there. She paused at the threshold. I'll be in the nursery at dawn. You can have my resignation then, or you can dismantle the cameras in their bedroom. But I won't be watched while I heal them. Not anymore. As she walked away, Vane remained in the dark room, holding his breath. He looked down at his hands that had ordered hits, signed death warrants, and built an empire of fear. For the first time in 3 years, they were shaking. He went back to his office, but he didn't look at the monitors. He sat in the dark, the blue light of the screens reflected in his eyes, realizing that the most dangerous person in his house wasn't the assassin at the gates, it was the woman who had just told him the truth. The morning light crawled over the limestone walls of the Thorn Manor, but it felt cold, lacking the warmth that usually accompanied the dawn. Vane had not slept. He had spent the remaining hours of the night sitting in his leather chair, the glow of 50 monitors finally extinguished. For the first time since the red winter hit, the security room was a void of darkness. He had done the unthinkable, he had turned off the feed to the nursery. Walking toward the children's wing, Vane felt a strange, jarring sense of vulnerability. Without the cameras to act as his eyes, the house felt cavernous and unpredictable. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the ivy-covered windows made his hand twitch toward the concealed holster at his small of back. This was the paranoia that had kept him alive, the instinct that had allowed him to build a criminal empire from the wreckage of his youth. But as he reached the heavy oak doors of the nursery, he forced his hands to remain at his sides. He pushed the door open slowly. He expected to find Elara packing her bags, or perhaps standing in a corner with the same guarded expression he had seen on every other employee. Instead, the sight that met him was one that no high-definition lens could have captured with justice. The nursery was bathed in a soft, golden hue. Elara was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, with Leo and Mia on either side of her. They weren't in their wheelchairs. For the first time in 3 years, they were on the rug, their small bodies leaning into her as if she were the very center of their gravity. Elara was holding a book, but she wasn't reading. She was tracing the children's palms with her fingertips, moving in that same rhythmic, sensory pattern Vane had witnessed on the screen. I didn't hear the cameras reset this morning, Elara said, not looking up. The little red lights are dark. I turned them off, Vane replied, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. He stepped into the room, feeling like an intruder in his own home. I'm trying to listen to what you said. Elara finally looked up. Her eyes were tired, shadowed by the same grief that haunted the hallways, but there was a flicker of something else there, a spark of hope that looked like a challenge. It's a start. But silence is hard for a man who lives on noise and data, isn't it? Vane walked over and lowered himself onto a chair, watching his children. Leo looked at him, actually looked at him, and for a fleeting second, the boy's lips trembled as if trying to form a syllable that had been lost in the fire. Vane felt a lump form in his throat, a physical manifestation of the wall inside him beginning to crack. Tell me about the hit, Vane commanded, though it came out as a plea. The official reports are sanitized. I need to know what happened in the minutes I wasn't there. Elara closed the book and pulled the children closer. The SUV didn't just flip, Vane. It was targeted. I was 3 cars behind in an unbadged transport unit when I saw the flash. I wasn't supposed to stop, my orders were to proceed to the local station, but I saw a woman's hand reach through the shattered glass of the rear window. It was Rachel. Vane closed his eyes, the image searing into his mind. The gunmen were still there, Alara continued, her voice steady despite the weight of the memory. They were circling back to finish the job. I didn't have a weapon, only my trauma kit. I dragged Leo out first. He wasn't breathing. I had to perform a needle thoracostomy while bullets were hitting the pavement inches from my boots. Rachel was pinned. She knew she wasn't going to make it. She looked me in the eye, blood masking her face, and she didn't scream. She whispered, "Save the song. Teach them the song." The mother's frequency, Vane whispered. She knew that if they survived the fire, the silence would be what killed them, Alara said. I got Mia out just as the fuel tank ignited. That's when I took the round. It felt like a hot iron pressing into my spine. I fell on top of them, using my body to shield them from the heat and the lead. I woke up 3 days later in a black site hospital with no identity and no womb. They told me I was a hero, and then they told me I no longer existed. Vane stood up and paced to the window, his chest heaving. The sheer scale of her sacrifice made his own brand of protection look like cowardice. He had hidden behind glass, she had stood in the fire. He had hunted for enemies, she had hunted for the children's souls. My people found a burner phone in your room last night, Vane said, turning back to her. That's why I came in. I thought you were talking to the Morettas. Alara reached into her pocket and pulled out a battered, old model phone. She tossed it onto the rug. Call the only number in the contacts, Vane. Go ahead. Vane picked it up and dialed. He expected a gravelly voice of a rival boss or a mercenary. Instead, the line was picked up by a woman whose voice was frail and shaking with age. Is that you, Alara? Did the boys sleep through the night? Did you give them the lavender oil I sent? Vane froze. Who is this? This is Martha, the voice replied, confused. Rachel's nurse from when she was a girl. Who is this? Is Alara okay? Vane hung up, the phone feeling like a lead weight. He looked at Alara, who was now helping Leo move his fingers to grasp a wooden toy. You've been in contact with Rachel's old staff. The ones you fired or frightened away, Alara said. The ones who actually knew what those children needed. I've spent 3 years gathering the pieces of their lives that you threw away because you were too busy looking for assassins. I didn't need a mafia empire to find the truth, Vane. I just needed to care. Vane felt a wave of shame so profound it eclipsed his anger. He had been so focused on the who of the betrayal that he had ignored the how of the healing. He had treated his home like a crime scene, and in doing so, he had kept the crime alive every single day. I fired you last night, Vane said softly. In my head, I had already drafted the order to have you escorted from the grounds. I know, Alara replied. And yet, here I am. And here you are, without a camera between us. Vane looked at his son, then at his daughter. For the first time, he didn't see them as broken assets or tragic reminders of his failure. He saw them as children who were waiting for their father to come home from the war. Stay, Vane said. It wasn't a command. It was a surrender. Not as a maid. Not as a ghost. Stay as their teacher. Teach me the song, Alara. Teach me how to be in the room without wanting to destroy everything outside of it. Alara stood up, smoothing her apron. For the first time, she offered him a small, guarded smile. The song is easy, Vane. It's the silence that's hard. Are you ready to be quiet enough to hear them? Before Vane could answer, a sharp, rhythmic pulsing came from the handheld radio on his belt. It was his head of security, his voice tight with alarm. Boss, we've got a perimeter breach. North Gate. 2 black SUVs, no plates. They've bypassed the external sensors. They're coming for the house. Vane's eyes snapped to Alara. The peace of the moment was shattered instantly, replaced by the cold, familiar electricity of a coming storm. The Morettas hadn't forgotten. They had been waiting for the cameras to go dark. Take them to the safe room, Vane barked, his hand finally closing around the grip of his weapon. No, Alara said, her eyes turning into flint. The safe room is a box. If they get inside, we're trapped. I know this house better than your security team does, Vane. I've spent 14 nights mapping the blind spots your cameras missed. Vane looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the operative he had been searching for all along. What do you need? I need you to trust me, she said. And I need you to stay behind me. I've already saved these children once. I'm not losing them to the same monsters twice. Vane stood at the precipice of a decision that defied every instinct he had honed in the trenches of the London underworld. The alarm from his radio was a jagged blade cutting through the newfound stillness of the nursery, yet Alara's presence was even more commanding. She didn't look like a maid anymore, she looked like a general who had already seen the end of the war. The safe room is where men like you go to die, Vane, Alara said, her voice dropping into a low, tactical cadence. It's a target. You've built it to withstand a siege, but a siege only lasts until the oxygen runs out or the door is breached. If you want them to live, we have to move through the house. Vane gripped his weapon, his eyes darting to Leo and Mia. They were wide-eyed, sensing the sudden shift in the air, the familiar scent of fear that had permeated their lives for so long. There are 2 SUVs, Alara. That's at least 8 men. My security team is being bypassed. How do you know the blind spots? Because for 14 nights, I've been looking for a way out, she replied, picking up Mia with a strength that belied her frame. I knew your past would catch up to you. I knew the Morettas wouldn't let the Thorn heirs grow up to seek revenge. Follow me, and tell your men to hold the north wing. Let the attackers think we're cornered in the safe room. We're taking the service tunnels. Vane signaled his head of security, barked the orders to create a diversion, and then followed the woman he had intended to fire. They moved with a silent, fluid grace through the shadows of the manor. Alara led them not toward the reinforced steel of the basement vault, but toward the old laundry chute behind the kitchen, a remnant of the original 19th century architecture that Vane had deemed too small for a threat to enter, and thus, too small for his cameras to prioritize. As they moved, the sound of breaking glass and suppressed gunfire echoed from the north wing. Vane felt the familiar coldness settle over him, the ice of the kingpin. He was ready to kill, ready to burn the world to protect the 2 small lives in Alara's arms. But as he watched her navigate the dark, he realized she wasn't just protecting them, she was navigating them toward a future he hadn't believed possible. They reached the service tunnel, a cramped, damp corridor that led toward the old carriage house. Vane checked his tactical watch. We have 3 minutes before they realize the nursery is empty. Why did you really come here, Alara? Was it just the promise? She paused, the flickering light of a distant security lamp catching the silver of her eyes. I came because I couldn't live with the silence either, Vane. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Rachel's voice. I heard the twins' heartbeat. I thought if I could just make them laugh once, the hole in my own soul would start to close. A heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards above them, the sound of his office door being kicked in. Vane's jaw tightened. They're in my sanctum. Let them have the room, Alara whispered, stepping into the damp air of the carriage house. They're looking for a mafia boss. They aren't prepared for a mother who has already lost everything once. Vane looked at her, then at his children, who were clinging to her neck with a ferocity they had never shown him. He realized then that his 50 cameras had been looking for a war, but Alara had been preparing for a rescue. The Maid of Shadows was the only person in the world who could see through the dark he had built around himself. Vane felt the heavy thrum of the manor's emergency generators kicking in, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the ancient stones of the service tunnel. Above them, the muffled sounds of the invasion grew more frantic. The Moretti mercenaries were realizing they had stormed a fortress only to find an empty nest. Vane's hand tightened on the grip of his sidearm, his knuckles white. He was a man defined by his territory, and leaving his throne felt like a slow-acting poison in his veins. "They're moving toward the west wing," Vane whispered, checking a small encrypted tablet he had pulled from his belt. "My lead security officer, Kale, is engaging them near the library. He's outnumbered." "Kale is a good man, but he's fighting a war of attrition," Alara said, her eyes scanning the exit of the tunnel that opened into the carriage house. She hadn't put the children down. Mia was tucked against her chest, her small face buried in Alara's neck, while Leo gripped the fabric of her shoulder with a strength Vane hadn't seen in years. "If we stay here, they'll eventually sweep the grounds with thermal tech. We need to reach the tree line." Vane looked at the expanse of open lawn between the carriage house and the dense woods of the estate. It was nearly 80 yards of exposure. In the pale morning light, they would be clear targets for any marksman positioned on the manor's roof. "I'll draw their fire," Vane said, his voice returning to the cold, authoritative tone of the underworld kingpin. "I'll break for the fountain. You take the kids through the high grass by the eastern perimeter." Alara stopped, her gaze locking onto his with a searing intensity. "No. You're thinking like a martyr, Vane. If you die, the Morettis don't just win, they inherit the vacuum you leave behind. They won't stop until Leo and Mia are gone too, just to ensure there are no Thorn heirs left to seek vengeance in 20 years. We go together, or we don't go at all. I am the target, Alara. Not you. You were the target 3 years ago," she hissed, her voice a sharp blade in the damp tunnel. "And look who paid the price. Look at your children's legs, Vane. Look at the silence in their throats. This isn't about you anymore. It's about them. Now, move." She didn't wait for his approval. She stepped out into the crisp morning air, using the shadows of the carriage house's stone buttresses to mask their movement. Vane followed, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt naked without his monitors, without the 50 eyes that usually told him exactly where the danger was. He had to rely on his own senses, the smell of gunpowder on the wind, the crunch of frost underfoot, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the woman in front of him. Suddenly, a red laser dot danced across the stone pillar inches from Alara's head. "Sniper! North balcony!" Vane roared. He didn't think. He lunged forward, his large frame shielding Alara and the children as he squeezed off 3 rapid shots toward the manor's roofline. The sniper's silhouette ducked behind the balustrade. "Run!" Vane commanded. They sprinted. The world became a blur of green and gray. Vane could hear the heavy boots of the mercenaries hitting the gravel behind them. He turned as he ran, firing suppressive rounds, his eyes darting between the threat behind and the woman in front. Alara reached the tree line first. She slid behind a massive, ancient oak tree, shielding the children with her own body. Vane dove in beside her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He checked his magazine, he was running low. "They're coming," Vane said, his eyes fixed on the house. "At least 4 of them." "Alara, if I don't." "Don't you dare," she interrupted, reaching out and grabbing the lapel of his tactical vest. "Look at them, Vane. Look at your son." Vane looked down. Leo wasn't crying. He wasn't shaking. The boy was watching Alara, his small hand moving in a rhythmic tap against her arm, the frequency. He was self-soothing using the technique she had taught him. He was brave because she was there. "You taught him that," Vane whispered, the realization hitting him harder than any bullet could. "He's a thorn," Alara said. "He was always brave. He just needed to know he wasn't alone in the dark." The sound of snapping branches echoed through the woods. The hunters had arrived. Vane stood up, his face hardening into a mask of pure, lethal intent. He wasn't just a mafia boss protecting his assets anymore. He was a father protecting the woman who had brought his children back to life. "Stay behind the oak," Vane ordered, his voice a low growl. "And keep humming, Alara. Don't let them hear the silence." As he stepped out to meet the men who had destroyed his life 3 years ago, Vane Thorne realized he didn't need 50 cameras to see the truth. He only needed one reason to live, and she was currently holding his world in her arms. The woods surrounding the Thorne Manor were ancient, a dense thicket of oak and ash that had stood for centuries, but to Vane, they had become a tactical chessboard. He moved through the undergrowth with a predatory stillness, his senses heightened by the absence of his digital crutches. Behind him, he could hear the faint, rhythmic humming from Alara, the mother's frequency. It was a thin thread of sanity in a world that had suddenly dissolved into violence. He saw the first mercenary near a cluster of ferns. The man was moving too fast, overconfident, thinking he was hunting a broken billionaire and a terrified maid. Vane didn't use his gun. He didn't want to give away his exact position to the others. He waited until the man passed his tree, then struck. It was a silent, brutal efficiency born of the London streets. Vane caught him in a sleeper hold, his massive arms like iron bands, lowering the unconscious body to the forest floor without a sound. 1 down. 3 left. Vane checked his surroundings. The morning fog was rolling in, thick and gray, clinging to the damp earth. It was a gift. He melted back into the mist, moving toward the sound of snapping twigs to his left. "Vane," a voice called out, low and mocking. It was a voice he recognized, Enzo Moretti, the younger brother of the man who had ordered the hit 3 years ago. "Why are you running, Vane? You spent 3 years building a cage for yourself. We thought we'd come and help you decorate it with a bit of red." Vane stayed silent. He was circling, using the high grass and the fog to his advantage. He could see Enzo now, standing in a small clearing, flanked by 2 professionals in tactical gear. They were carrying submachine guns, their eyes scanning the tree line with infrared goggles. "I know you're out there," Enzo continued, pacing with a casual arrogance. "And I know you have the kids. And the new girl. She's a pretty thing, Vane. A bit too brave for her own good, though. My man on the roof said she looked like a pro. Where did you find her? A secret agency? Or did you just get lucky at the employment office?" Vane's blood turned to liquid fire. The mention of Alara in Enzo's mouth felt like a desecration. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a flashbang grenade, one of the few items he had managed to grab from the security suite before the lights went out. He counted to 3 and tossed it. The explosion was a deafening roar of light and sound. In the split second of chaos, Vane emerged from the fog like a vengeful ghost. He fired his sidearm with surgical precision. The 2 mercenaries dropped before they could even level their weapons. Enzo, shielded by a tree, lunged for his fallen comrade's gun, but Vane was faster. He was on Enzo in a heartbeat, pinning him against the rough bark of the oak, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. 3 years, Vane hissed, his blue eyes burning with a cold, terrifying light. 3 years I watched those cameras, waiting for your face to show up. Enzo choked, his face turning a dark purple. You were always a coward, Thorne. Hiding, behind, glass." "I wasn't hiding," Vane said, his voice a deadly whisper. "I was preparing." He didn't kill him. Death was too easy for the Morettis. Vane struck him with the butt of his gun, knocking him into a deep unconsciousness. He would deal with Enzo later. Right now, he had to get back to the only thing that mattered. He turned and sprinted back toward the giant oak where he had left Alara. When he arrived, he found her standing, her back against the trunk, holding a small tactical knife she must have hidden in her boot. Leo and Mia were at her feet, tucked into the hollow of the roots. "It's over," Vane said, his chest heaving as he holstered his weapon. "For now." Alara didn't lower the knife immediately. Her eyes searched his, looking for the man she had challenged in the nursery, the father, not the kingpin. Slowly, she relaxed her stance. The kids? Vane asked. They stayed quiet, she said, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. They did exactly what I told them. They're thorns, Vane. They have your steel. Vane knelt in the dirt, ignoring the dampness and the blood on his hands. He looked at Leo, who was staring at him with wide, curious eyes. For the first time, the boy didn't look away. He reached out and touched the sleeve of Vane's jacket. "Dad?" The word was small, a mere breath of sound, but it hit Vane harder than the explosion. The silence of 3 years had finally been broken. Vane pulled his son into his arms, then his daughter, sobbing into their hair as the fog swirled around them. Elara stood over them, a silent guardian in the gray light. She looked toward the manor, where the smoke was starting to clear. "The house is compromised," she said softly. "They'll send more." Vane stood up, holding both children. He looked at Elara, the woman who had lost her world to save his, and then at the manor he had turned into a tomb. "Let them come," Vane said, his voice regaining its absolute, ironclad certainty. "We're not going back to the cameras, Elara. We're going to find a home." As they began to walk deeper into the woods, leaving the house of thorn behind, Vane realized that the most important thing he had ever seen on his monitors wasn't a threat. It was the moment he stopped watching his life and started living it. Vane moved through the dense foliage with the 2 children pressed against him, their weight a reminder of everything he had nearly lost to his own blindness. Elara walked a pace behind, her eyes constantly scanning the canopy and the floor for tripwires or heat signatures. The adrenaline of the firefight was fading, replaced by the cold, tactical reality of their situation. "The SUVs are gone," Elara whispered, tilting her head to catch the distant drone of engines fading toward the main road. But Enzo was just the vanguard. "The Morettas don't send the younger brother unless they want to humiliate the target before the kill. They'll be back with a sweep team within the hour." Vane stopped near a small, rocky outcrop that offered a natural vantage point over the valley. He set Leo and Mia down gently. "I have a safe house in the city, but the moment I ping the network to unlock the biometric gates, the Morettas will track the signal. My own digital infrastructure has become my greatest enemy." Elara knelt beside the children, checking their pulse points with a practiced hand. "Then we don't go to the city. We go to the only place they won't look, a place that doesn't exist on your maps." Vane looked at her, his brow furrowed. "I've mapped every inch of this county, Elara. There isn't a square foot of land I don't monitor." "You monitor the land you own," she countered, her voice soft but firm. "But there's an old infirmary near the coast, an abandoned site from the war. It was used by my old agency as a fallback point. It's shielded by the salt air and the lead-lined walls of the old bunkers. No thermal, no GPS. It's a dead zone." Vane hesitated. Entering a dead zone meant surrendering his last thread of control. It meant being truly invisible, not just to his enemies, but to his own resources. He looked at Leo, who was tracing a pattern in the dirt with his finger. The boy looked up, his eyes meeting Vane's, and for the first time, Vane didn't see a victim. He saw a survivor. "How far?" Vane asked. 10 miles through the old logging trails," Elara said. "We can't take the main roads. We have to move on foot until we hit the coast." 10 miles with 2 children who can't walk?" Vane asked, the logistical impossibility of it weighing on him. Elara reached into the small tactical pack Vane had grabbed from the carriage house. She pulled out 2 sets of reinforced carrying slings, items he had bought months ago but never used because he had preferred the safety of the wheelchairs. "We don't need wheels where we're going, Vane. We need heart." She strapped Mia to her back, the child molding against her with a trust that was almost painful to witness. Vane did the same with Leo. As the straps tightened, Vane felt the warmth of his son's chest against his spine. It was a connection no camera could ever replicate. As they stepped deeper into the woods, leaving the burning remains of his old life behind, Vane felt a strange sensation. The ice of the kingpin was melting, replaced by a raw, terrifying vitality. He wasn't watching a movie of his life anymore. He was the protagonist in a story that hadn't been written yet. "Elara," Vane said, his voice low as they pushed through a thicket of pine. "Why did you stay? When the bullets started flying, you could have left. You could have been halfway to the border by now." She didn't turn around, but he saw her shoulders square. "Because when I lost my daughter on that motorway, I made a deal with the universe. I told whatever was listening that if I could just save one part of that night, I'd never let go. I'm not just saving your kids, Vane. I'm saving the only version of myself that still matters." Vane looked at the path ahead, the gray fog beginning to lift to reveal a rugged, beautiful landscape he had ignored for years. He realized that the Maid of Shadows wasn't just a guardian, she was his mirror. They were both haunted by the same fire, both trying to outrun a silence that had nearly swallowed them whole. "I'll get us there," Vane promised, more to the child on his back than to the woman in front of him. "And then I'm going to tear the Moretti name out of the history books." "Do what you have to do, Vane," Elara replied. "But remember, once you burn it all down, make sure there's something left for them to stand on." The fog had finally surrendered to a biting coastal wind that carried the scent of salt and decaying kelp. Vane could feel Leo's small hands tightening around his neck, the boy's breathing rhythmic and steady against his spine. Ahead of them, Elara moved with a tireless, haunting grace. She didn't look back to check if he was keeping up. She knew the man behind her was fueled by a brand of desperation that didn't allow for exhaustion. They reached the edge of the logging trail where the forest thinned, revealing the jagged silhouette of the Atlantic coast. The old infirmary sat perched on a cliffside like a skeletal bird of prey, its windows boarded and its stone facade eaten away by decades of sea spray. There, Elara pointed toward a low-slung concrete structure half buried in the hillside. "The entrance is behind the ventilation shaft. It's a subterranean bypass. Even if they have satellites over this sector, they'll only see a ruin." Vane scanned the perimeter. His tactical brain was screaming, this was a kill box. One way in, one way out. If the Morettis found them here, there would be no woods to disappear into. But he looked at Mia, whose head was lolling against Elara's shoulder in a state of total exhaustion, and he knew they couldn't push any further. "Move," Vane grunted. They descended the rocky slope, Vane using his free hand to steady himself against the loose shale. Elara led them to a heavy steel door obscured by rusted corrugated iron. She didn't use a key, she pressed a specific sequence into a keypad hidden behind a loose brick. The door groaned open with a heavy, pressurized hiss. The air inside was cold and smelled of ozone and old bandages. Elara found a manual lantern by the entrance and struck a match. The yellow light flickered to life, illuminating a long, narrow corridor lined with lead-shielded walls. The infirmary was a fallback for the agency's unmentionables, Elara explained, her voice echoing in the hollow space. "It's off the grid. No digital footprint. No Thorn surveillance." She led them to a small room at the end of the hall that had been converted into a makeshift living quarters. There were 2 cots, a crate of emergency rations, and a basic medical station. Gently, she unstrapped Mia and laid her down. Vane did the same with Leo, his muscles screaming in protest as he finally released the weight of his son. For a moment, they both just stood there, watching the children sleep in the dim lantern light. The silence here was different from the silence of the manor. It wasn't a silence of mourning, it was a silence of survival. "I need to check the perimeter sensors," Elara said, turning to a wall of old-fashioned analog dials and toggle switches. "They're hardwired to the fence line. If anything larger than a fox crosses the perimeter, these needles will jump." Vane watched her work. The way her hands moved over the equipment, precise, cold, and professional, made him realize how much he had underestimated the woman who had been scrubbing his floors. "You were never just a paramedic, were you?" Vane asked, leaning against the cold concrete wall. Elara paused, her hand on a toggle switch. She didn't look at him. I was a recovery specialist. My job was to go into the places where everyone else had died and bring back whatever was left. Usually, it was data. On the M25, it was your family. And the agency? They don't like witnesses to failed operations. Especially witnesses who know about the song. She finally turned to face him, her eyes hard. Your wife didn't just learn that frequency in a lab, Vane. She learned it from us. It was used to stabilize agents in high-stress trauma. Rachel was trying to use a weapon of the state to heal her children. Vane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the coastal air. His wife had been keeping secrets, not out of malice, but to build a shield around their family that even he didn't understand. I've spent 3 years looking for the people who killed her, Vane said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. I thought I knew the enemy. I thought it was just the Morettas wanting my territory. The Morettas provided the guns, Elara said softly. But someone gave them the route. Someone told them the cameras on the motorway would be glitching for exactly 6 minutes. You've been watching your house for 3 years, Vane, but you should have been watching the people who built your fortress. Before Vane could respond, the analog needle on the wall jumped. Then another. Click. 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 Elara's face went pale. They're here. And they didn't follow us through the woods. Then how? Vane asked, his hand going to his weapon. They didn't follow us, she whispered, looking at the door they had just entered. They were already waiting. This was never a safe house, Vane. It was a trap. From the corridor outside, the sound of heavy boots began to rhythmically approach. But it wasn't the chaotic scramble of Moretti thugs. It was the synchronized, heavy tread of a professional hit squad. Vane stepped in front of the sleeping children, his piercing blue eyes catching the yellow lantern light. He looked at Elara, and for the first time, there was no suspicion between them, only the grim, shared understanding of two people who had run out of places to hide. Teach me the rest of the song, Elara, Vane said, leveling his gun at the door. Because if we're going to die in this hole, I want to make sure they hear us coming. The steel door to the infirmary didn't just open, it was blown inward by a localized breaching charge that sent a cloud of pulverized concrete and white smoke into the room. Vane didn't wait for the air to clear. He fired into the haze, his rounds finding the ceramic plating of a lead operative's vest. The man stumbled back, but the professional precision of the squad was undeterred. They moved in a diamond formation, their suppressed weapons spitting silent, lethal tongues of flame. Get down! Vane roared, throwing himself over the cots where Leo and Mia lay. Elara was already in motion. She didn't reach for a gun, she reached for the lantern. With a swift, practiced kick, she shattered the glass against the concrete floor. The fuel ignited, creating a momentary wall of fire between them and the doorway. In the flickering orange chaos, she grabbed a heavy medical equipment trunk and shoved it upright to create a secondary barricade. They aren't Morettas, Elara hissed, her voice sharp as glass. She was crouching low, her tactical knife held in a reverse grip. Look at their movement. That's a ghost retrieval unit. My old agency. They didn't come to help, Vane. They came to scrub the witnesses. Vane popped up from behind the trunk, firing 2 rounds that caught a second operative in the neck. Then we don't hold the room. We push through. The ventilation shaft. Elara pointed to a rusted grate high on the back wall, barely visible behind a stack of old hospital gurneys. It leads to the old elevator motor room. It's too small for them to follow quickly in full gear. Vane grabbed Leo, tucking the boy under one arm like a football, while Elara scooped up Mia. They scrambled over the gurneys, the metal screeching against the floor. Behind them, the fire was dying, and the black-clad shadows were advancing through the smoke. Vane slammed the butt of his gun into the grate, the rusted bolts snapping with a satisfying crack. He boosted Alara up first. She disappeared into the dark, narrow tunnel, reaching back to take Mia from him. Next, he hoisted Leo up. The boy's eyes were wide, but he didn't make a sound. He was clutching the small wooden toy he had taken from the nursery, his knuckles white. Go. Vane urged. He pulled himself into the shaft just as a hail of bullets shredded the gurneys he had stood on seconds before. The tunnel was a coffin of cold tin and cobwebs. They crawled in a frantic, scraping rhythm, the sound of their own breathing loud in the confined space. They'll be at the motor room exit in 3 minutes, Alara whispered from ahead. We need a diversion. Vane, do you still have the flashbang? One left, he panted, the weight of his son and the exertion of the crawl pushing him to his limit. Give it to me. I know the layout of the motor room. There's a backup fuel line for the old generator. If I can vent the pressure and trigger the flash, we can blow the upper level. Vane reached forward, sliding the canister to her. Alara, if that floor goes, we're trapped in the sub-basement. It's better to be buried than to be executed, she replied. They reached the end of the shaft and dropped into a room filled with the skeletal remains of rusted pulleys and grease-stained cables. The air here was thick with the smell of diesel. Alara moved to a series of valves, her hands working with a mechanical certainty. Wait for my signal, she commanded. Suddenly, the heavy door to the motor room began to glow. A thermal torch was cutting through the hinges. Vane leveled his gun, his heart hammering. He looked at Leo, who had crawled into a corner, shivering. Leo, look at me, Vane whispered, the ice of the kingpin finally cracking. I'm not going to let them in. Do you hear me? I'm your father. I'm the wall. The boy nodded slowly, and for the first time, he whispered a word that wasn't Dad. Song, Leo breathed. Sing, song. Vane froze. He didn't know the frequency. He didn't know the notes. But he looked at Alara, and she began to hum. Even as she prepared to blow the room, she hummed the low, steady vibration. Vane joined in, a rough, deep baritone that lacked her grace but held all of his soul. The door burst open. Now! Alara screamed. She pulled the pin and threw the flashbang into the pool of vented diesel. Vane grabbed the children and dove behind the massive cast-iron base of the elevator motor. The world turned white. A roar of heat and pressure slammed into them, the sound of the explosion muffled by the concrete deep beneath the earth. The ceiling groaned, and a cascade of dust and debris rained down, burying the entrance in a mountain of rubble. Silence returned, but it wasn't the silence of the manor. It was the silence of a tomb. Vane coughed, wiping the soot from his eyes. He looked around. The room was dark, the only light coming from the glowing embers of the fuel fire. Alara was slumped against the far wall, her forehead bleeding, but she was breathing. He looked at the children. They were huddled together, covered in dust, but alive. Vane stood up, his legs shaking. He walked to the collapsed doorway. The exit was gone. They were 40 feet underground, trapped in a dead zone, with an agency hunting them and no way out. Vane, Alara's voice was weak, but it held a strange, new clarity. They think we're dead now. The explosion, it'll mask our heat signatures. We have a few hours before they start digging. Vane sat back down in the dirt, pulling his children into his lap. He looked at the woman who had led him into the dark to save him. We're off the grid, Vane said, a small, dark smile touching his lips. No cameras. No Moretus. No ghosts. Just us, Alara replied. Just us, Vane echoed. As they sat in the darkness of the ruined infirmary, Vane Thorne finally understood. He had spent his life building a fortress to keep the world out, only to realize that the only thing worth protecting was the people willing to sit with him in the rubble. The dust in the sub-basement motor room refused to settle, hanging in the air like a heavy, gray shroud. Every breath Vane took tasted of pulverized concrete and old oil, but it was the taste of survival. He sat with his back against the vibrating cast iron housing of the elevator motor, the two children huddled into the crook of his arms. They were trembling, but they were silent, a silence no longer born of trauma, but of a shared, primal understanding of the hunt. Vane looked across the dark space at Alara. The orange glow from the dying diesel fire cast long, flickering shadows across her face. She was wiping blood from a gash on her temple with the hem of her apron, her movements mechanical and precise. "They'll bring in the heavy equipment," Vane said, his voice a low vibration that barely carried over the settling debris. "They saw us enter. They won't believe the explosion killed us until they count the bodies." Alara looked at the wall of rubble that had once been their only exit. "Let them dig. The agency operates on a timeline of efficiency. If they don't find us in the first 2 hours, they'll assume the blast triggered a secondary collapse of the old infirmary's foundation. They'll seal the site and mark it as a structural casualty. They can't risk a prolonged recovery operation so close to a civilian coastline." "And us?" Vane asked, looking up at the ceiling where a cracked pipe was dripping brackish water. "We're buried alive." "Not yet," she replied, standing up with a slight wince. She walked to the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed deepest. When this place was an agency fallback, they didn't just build an entrance. They built an escape. There's a drainage culvert that runs from the motor room's cooling system directly out to the sea caves. It's narrow, and it's likely flooded with the tide, but it's a way out. Vane stood up, the weight of Leo in his arms feeling different now. The boy was no longer a burden of guilt, he was a heartbeat he had to protect. He walked over to Alara, looking down at the rusted iron grate she was currently prying at with her tactical knife. "You knew," Vane said, a spark of his old suspicion flickering, though it lacked its usual bite. "You knew this was a trap. You knew the agency would be waiting." Alara stopped, her hands resting on the cold iron. She finally looked him in the eye, her expression raw. "I didn't know they were already there, Vane. But I knew they were watching. I've been a ghost for 3 years, but ghosts leave footprints in the digital snow. When I took the job at your manor, I knew I was lighting a flare. I did it because the Morettas were closing in on you, and I knew you wouldn't listen to a stranger. I had to get inside." "You used yourself as bait," Vane whispered. "I used myself as a shield," she corrected. "And now, the shield is broken. We have one chance to get these children to the water. If we don't make it through the culvert before the tide hits its peak, we drown in the dark." Vane looked at Leo and Mia. They were watching him, their eyes reflecting the dim embers of the fire. For the first time, Vane didn't see the 50 monitors of his office. He didn't see the spreadsheets of his empire or the faces of his enemies. He saw the woman who had sacrificed her life twice over for a family that wasn't hers, and he saw the children who were finally looking at him as a father instead of a ghost. "Open it," Vane commanded. With a heave of combined strength, they wrenched the grate upward. A blast of cold, wet air rushed up to meet them, carrying the thunderous roar of the Atlantic crashing into the sea caves below. It was a dark, terrifying abyss, but as Vane looked at Alara, he realized he wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. He had been living in it for 3 years. He reached out and took Alara's hand, not as a boss, not as a kingpin, but as a partner. "Teach me the rest of the song, Alara. Not for the cameras. For the journey." She squeezed his hand back, her fingers steady. "The song is already in you, Vane. You just had to turn off the screens to hear it." As they lowered themselves into the narrow, watery tunnel, leaving the ruins of the infirmary behind, the first sounds of heavy machinery began to grind against the earth far above. The agency was digging for corpses, but the Thorne family was already moving toward the light. The culvert was a nightmare of tight concrete and freezing, waist-deep water. Vane moved first, his large shoulders scraping against the slime-slicked walls as he held Leo high against his chest. Behind him, he could hear the splash of Alara's movements and the soft, terrified whimpers of Mia. Every few seconds, the tunnel would groan as the weight of the sea crashed against the exterior of the cliffside, sending a backwash of salt water surging toward them. "Keep moving, Vane." Ilara's voice was strained, muffled by the narrow dimensions of the pipe. "The tide is coming in. If we don't reach the cavern mouth in 5 minutes, the pressure will lock the air out." Vane gritted his teeth, his boots slipping on the silk-covered floor. His muscles were screaming, but the feel of Leo's small heart beating rapidly against his own chest gave him a strength that was purely primal. He wasn't a kingpin here. He wasn't a billionaire. He was a father fighting the ocean for his son's life. Suddenly, the tunnel opened. They tumbled out into a massive sea cave, the air exploding with the thunderous roar of the Atlantic. The water here was deeper, swirling in violent eddies around jagged pillars of rock. Above them, a sliver of gray morning light pierced through a crack in the cavern roof, illuminating the churning foam. "There! The ledge!" Vane shouted over the roar, pointing to a flat shelf of stone 10 feet above the waterline. He waded through the chest-deep surf, fighting the undertow that threatened to pull him out to the open sea. He reached the ledge and hoisted Leo up. The boy scrambled onto the dry stone, reaching back with a trembling hand. Vane turned just in time to see a massive wave surge into the cave, momentarily submerging Ilara and Mia. "Ilara!" Vane's roar was lost in the spray. A second later, Ilara's head broke the surface. She was gasping, one arm locked around Mia, the other clawing at a piece of rusted rebar protruding from the cave wall. Vane lunged into the water, his fingers catching the strap of her tactical pack. With a heave that felt like it would tear his tendons, he swung them both toward the ledge. They collapsed onto the stone, for souls drenched and shivering in the dim, salt-heavy light. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic, booming violence of the tide. Vane sat up, wiping the brine from his eyes. He looked at Ilara. She was huddled over Mia, checking the girl's breathing. Her face was pale, her lips blue from the cold, but when she looked at him, her eyes were burning with a fierce, unbreakable light. "We're out," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The sensors, the agency, they can't see us here." Vane looked up at the sliver of light far above. He realized that for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't being watched. There were no cameras, no microphones, no digital ghosts. He looked at his son, who was sitting up and looking at the ocean with a strange, quiet wonder. "The House of Thorn is gone," Vane said, his voice low. "The house was just stone and glass, Vane," Ilara replied, reaching out to touch his hand. Her skin was freezing, but her grip was iron. This is the first time you've all been under the same roof." Vane looked at the 3 of them, the broken operative who had become a mother, and the 2 children who were finally coming back to life. He realized the mother's frequency wasn't just a song or a vibration. It was the sound of a family surviving. "We're not going to the safe house," Vane said, a new resolve hardening in his chest. "And we're not running to the city. We're going to vanish, Ilara. Truly vanish. Until I'm ready to come back and finish this." "And when you come back?" she asked. Vane looked at his hands, then at his children. "When I come back, I won't be a kingpin. I'll be a reckoning." As the tide continued to rise, sealing the entrance to the infirmary forever, Vane Thorn finally let go of his past. He closed his eyes and, for the first time in his life, he didn't need to see what was coming next. He could feel it. The transformation of Vane Thorn began in the silence of a coastal cottage, miles away from the jagged cliffs of the infirmary and light years away from the digital fortress of his manor. For the first time in his adult life, Vane was truly invisible. There were no servers tracking his location, no satellites pinging his phone, and most importantly, no cameras recording his every movement. The cottage belonged to Ilara, a small, stone structure hidden in a valley of gorse and wild heather. It had been her sanctuary during the years she was dead to the world. Inside, the air didn't smell of ozone or expensive marble polish, it smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and the salt of the sea. Vane sat by the hearth, watching Alara work. She was no longer wearing the tactical gear or the blood-stained maid's apron. She wore an oversized wool sweater, her hair tied back loosely as she prepared a simple meal for the children. Leo and Mia were on the rug, playing with wooden blocks. They weren't just sitting, they were interacting. Leo would stack a block, and Mia would tap it, mimicking the sensory signals Alara had used to reach them. "You're watching them again," Alara said softly, placing a bowl of soup on the table. "But you're not looking for a threat this time." Vane looked up, his blue eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "I'm looking for the parts of them that I missed. I spent 3 years staring at them through a screen, measuring their heart rates and tracking their medication. I knew everything about their bodies, but I knew nothing about their souls." He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of bruised purple and gold. "The Morettas think I'm dead. The agency thinks I'm buried under 40 feet of concrete. For the first time, I have the advantage of being nothing." "Being nothing is a dangerous habit," Vane, Alara warned, joining him at the window. "The world doesn't stay quiet for long. Eventually, someone will notice the vacuum you left behind. The Thorn Empire is too big to simply vanish without a fight." "I don't care about the Empire," Vane said, and he realized he meant it. "I care about the people who gave the route to the Morettas. I care about the glitch on the motorway cameras. You said someone in my own fortress built the trap. If I'm going to protect them, I have to know who." Alara reached into a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards and pulled out a small, encrypted drive, the one thing she had saved from the infirmary before the blast. "This contains the handshake logs from the night of the Red Winter hit. It shows which terminal bypassed the motorway's security protocols. I couldn't crack it alone, but with your access codes." Vane took the drive, the weight of it feeling like a live wire. "If I plug this into a network, the agency will see the handshake. They'll know a ghost is haunting the system." "Then we don't use a network," Alara said, a spark of her tactical brilliance returning. "We use a closed-loop system. There's an old communications relay on the northern ridge. It's analog, used by the Coast Guard. If we can patch in there, we can read the drive without sending a signal to the cloud." Vane looked at the children, then at Alara. The peace of the cottage was a beautiful lie, a temporary pause in a war that was still raging in the shadows. He knew that to truly be a father, he had to finish being a kingpin. "We go tonight," Vane said. "Tonight," Alara agreed. As the moon rose over the valley, Vane Thorn prepared to enter the digital world one last time. But he wasn't going back as a watcher. He was going back as the storm. He looked at Leo, who was now fast asleep on the rug, clutching the wooden toy. Vane leaned down and kissed his son's forehead, a gesture he hadn't allowed himself in years. "I'm coming for them, Leo," he whispered. "And this time, I won't be watching through a screen. I'll be the one they never saw coming." The ascent to the northern ridge was a grueling reminder of the world Vane had tried to leave behind. He carried the heavy weight of the portable uplink gear, his boots sinking into the peat and heather. Behind him, Alara moved with the silent economy of a ghost, her eyes constantly darting to the horizon, watching for the sweep of a searchlight or the unnatural hum of a drone. They reached the relay station, a rusted, skeletal tower that groaned under the assault of the Atlantic wind. Inside the small concrete bunker at its base, the air was stagnant and smelled of scorched copper. Vane set the equipment down on a metal workbench, his hands moving with a frantic, cold energy. "The agency's fingerprints are all over this code," Vane muttered, the blue light of the terminal reflecting in his intense, unblinking eyes. He bypassed the primary firewall using a sequence he had memorized years ago, a backdoor he'd kept for a day that would never come. "It wasn't just a glitch, Alara. The motorway cameras were slaved to a secondary server inside my own manor." Alara leaned over his shoulder, her breath hitching. "Which terminal?" Vane's fingers froze over the keys. The screen scrolled through a list of internal MAC addresses until it settled on a single, high-priority ID. It wasn't the security desk. It wasn't his office. It was the terminal in the private study of Silas Thorne, Vane's own uncle and the man who had mentored him in the ways of the underworld. Silas, Vane whispered, the word tasting like ash. He didn't just give them the route. He gave them the house. He didn't want a successor, Alara said softly, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into a grim picture. He wanted a martyr. A tragedy he could use to consolidate power while you were too busy mourning to notice he was stealing your empire. The realization was a physical weight, heavier than the children he had carried through the sea caves. Every camera he had installed, every sensor he had calibrated, had been feeding data back to the man who had ordered the death of his wife. He had been living in a cage built by the very person he trusted to guard the gate. Suddenly, the terminal began to pulse red. A localized alarm blared from the small speakers. The handshake, Vane hissed. Silas's system just pinged the relay. He knows someone is looking into the Red Winter files. We have to go, Alara said, grabbing the encrypted drive. If he knows we're alive, he'll burn this entire valley to find us. Let him, Vane said, his voice dropping into a register of pure, lethal calm. He didn't look at the screen anymore, he looked at his hands. He thinks he's watching a ghost. But I've spent 3 years learning how to live in the shadows. He's about to find out what happens when the man behind the camera finally steps into the light. As they scrambled back down the ridge toward the cottage, Vane felt a strange sense of liberation. The mystery was gone. The enemy had a name. He looked at the dim light in the cottage window where his children were sleeping, and he knew that the time for hiding was over. The kingpin was dead, but the father had work to do. The descent from the ridge was no longer a retreat, it was the first march of a war. Vane moved with a cold, calculated fury, his mind replaying every interaction he had ever had with his uncle Silas. Every word of comfort after the accident, every piece of advice to let the professionals handle the security, had been a layer of the shroud Silas was wrapping around Vane's life. They reached the cottage just as the first tendrils of dawn began to bleed over the horizon. Inside, the hearth had gone cold, and the air held a premonition of danger. Alara immediately moved to the children, who were stirring in their sleep, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Vane, look, Alara whispered, pointing to a small, blinking light on the portable uplink device he had carried back. The ping didn't just notify Silas. It triggered a localized burn order. He's not sending a negotiation team. He's sending the cleaners. The cleaners? Vane asked, his hand hovering over the hilt of his weapon. The units Silas keeps off the books for internal audits, she explained, her face pale. They don't leave witnesses, and they don't care about collateral damage. If we stay here, this cottage becomes a funeral pyre. Vane looked at Leo and Mia. They were awake now, sitting up on the rug. Leo looked at his father, his small face etched with a maturity no 4-year-old should possess. He didn't cry. He simply reached out and took Mia's hand, anchoring her. We have 20 minutes, Vane said, his voice dropping into the command tone that had once ruled the London docks. Alara, take the children to the old smuggler's cove at the base of the valley. There's a fisherman's skiff hidden under the kelp nets. Take it and head for the open water. I'll meet you at the buoy at 0400. No, Alara said, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce loyalty. I'm not leaving you to face Silas's men alone. You're a father now, Vane, not a suicide mission. I'm not a suicide mission, Vane replied, stepping close to her, his blue eyes burning with an intensity that silenced the room. I'm the distraction. If they follow me into the gorse, they won't be looking for a boat. I've spent 3 years watching people through cameras, Alara. I know exactly how to lead a man into a blind spot. He reached out and touched her cheek, a brief, rough gesture of affection that held the weight of a lifetime of unspoken words. Then, he turned to his children. He knelt in the dirt, at their level, for the last time. "Leo, Mia," Vane said softly. "Listen to Alara. She's the song. I'll be right behind you. I promise." Leo nodded, his grip on Mia tightening. As Alara led them out the back door and into the mist of the valley, Vane stood alone in the center of the cottage. He didn't pick up a gun. Instead, he walked to the kitchen table and opened the laptop one last time. He didn't try to hide his signal anymore. He flooded the network, sending every byte of the Red Winter handshake logs to every rival boss, every crooked politician, and every news outlet in his database. He turned the cameras of the world onto Silas Thorne. "You like to watch, Uncle?" Vane whispered to the empty room as the distant hum of high-performance engines began to echo through the valley. "Then watch this." He struck a match and dropped it onto the pile of dry heather he had gathered by the door. As the cottage began to fill with smoke, Vane Thorne stepped out into the gorse, disappearing into the mist of his own making. The kingpin was gone. The ghost was gone. There was only a man, a valley, and a debt that was finally being paid in full. The gorse was a sea of jagged thorns and yellow blooms, and Vane moved through it like a ghost reclaimed by the earth. He could hear the high-pitched whine of tactical drones overhead, Silas's electronic hounds, but he didn't fear them. He had spent years studying the refresh rates and blind spots of every lens on the market. He knew that if he stayed low and moved in sync with the wind-blown brush, he was nothing more than a glitch in their sensors. The cleaners arrived with the clinical efficiency of a surgical strike. 3 black SUVs tore into the valley, their tires spitting gravel as they skidded to a halt in front of the burning cottage. Men in charcoal tactical gear spilled out, moving in a practiced suppression formation. They didn't shout, they didn't offer a chance to surrender. They simply opened fire on the burning structure, a hail of lead designed to ensure that if anyone was still inside, they would stay there forever. Vane watched from a ridge 100 yards away, his heart cold. He saw the lead operative, a man known only as the Architect, Silas's most loyal hound, gesture toward the smoke. "Clear the perimeter," the Architect barked, his voice carrying on the wind. "Find the woman and the spawn. Silas wants proof of the lineage's end." Vane felt a surge of protective rage, but he suppressed it. He needed them focused on him, not the smuggler's cove. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, handheld transmitter, a device he had rigged from the relay station's spare parts. He pressed a button, and half a mile to the west, a series of pre-planted signal flares ignited in the high grass. "There. West Ridge," one of the cleaners shouted. The drones pivoted instantly, their cameras locking onto the heat signatures of the magnesium flares. 2 of the SUVs roared into motion, tearing away from the cottage and toward the false trail. Vane stayed perfectly still, his blue eyes fixed on the Architect and the 2 men who remained at the cottage. He began to move. He didn't go for his gun, he went for the terrain. He slid down a steep embankment, his boots silent on the damp peat. He knew these hills better than any digital map could ever show. He moved behind the Architect's remaining SUV, a predatory shadow in the mist. Inside the cottage, the roof groaned and collapsed, sending a plume of sparks into the air. The Architect stood with his back to the gorse, watching the flames with a grim satisfaction. "You should have stayed in the basement, Thorne," the Architect muttered to the fire. "It would have been cleaner." "I never liked things clean," Vane's voice came from the shadows, low and terrifying. The Architect spun around, his weapon raised, but Vane was already upon him. This wasn't a firefight, it was a reckoning. Vane disarmed the man with a brutal, bone-snapping twist of the wrist and slammed him against the hot metal of the SUV. The other 2 cleaners turned, but Vane used the Architect as a human shield, his sidearm leveled with lethal precision. "Drop them," Vane commanded. "Or your boss finds a new Architect." The men hesitated. They were professionals, but they had never seen Vane Thorne like this. The man who had hidden behind cameras was gone. In his place was a father with nothing left to lose and a godlike knowledge of the battlefield. You're a dead man, Vane, the architect wheezed, blood leaking from his lip. Silas has the whole city. You have a pile of ash. I have something Silas will never understand, Vane replied, his eyes burning like blue ice. I have the truth. And I just sent it to everyone. At that moment, the architect's tactical tablet chirped, a high-priority alert. The Red Winter handshake logs were hitting the dark web, the mainstream news, and the police servers simultaneously. Silas Thorne's empire was imploding in real time. Vane struck the architect across the temple, knocking him unconscious, and turned his weapon on the remaining two. The boat is already at sea. My children are safe. Now, tell me where Silas is hiding, or I stop being a father and start being the man I used to be. As the distant sirens of the authorities began to wail from the valley entrance, drawn by the massive data dump and the fire, Vane Thorne realized the hunt was shifting. He wasn't the prey anymore. He was the hunter. Vane stood over the kneeling cleaners, the fire from the cottage casting long, jagged shadows across the gorse. The architect lay slumped against the SUV, his tactical headset crackling with frantic, panicked voices. The digital fortress Silas had built was crumbling. The data dump had turned the Thorne Empire into a burning target for every law enforcement agency and rival syndicate in Europe. Where is he? Vane repeated, his voice as cold as the morning dew. The younger of the two remaining cleaners looked at his tablet, then at Vane's unwavering aim. The Airy, he stammered. His private penthouse in the city. He's scrubbing the mainframes. He's planning to leave by the roof helipad at 0600. Vane checked his watch. 5:15, the city was a 40-minute drive, provided the roads weren't already crawling with the chaos he had unleashed. Take their zip ties, Vane ordered the man who had spoken. Secure your partner to the bull bar of the truck. Then secure yourself. If I find out you've lied, I won't need to come back for you. The police will be here in 10 minutes, and the Morettas will be here in 20. You'd better hope the police win the race. As the man complied with trembling hands, Vane moved to the architect. He reached into the man's vest and pulled out a high-gain encrypted radio and a set of keys to the lead SUV. He didn't look back at the burning remains of the cottage, the place that had sheltered his children, now sacrificed to shield them. He climbed into the driver's seat of the black SUV, the interior smelling of expensive leather and gun oil. He ignited the engine, the powerful V8 roaring to life, a mechanical beast ready for the final hunt. Before shifting into gear, he pulled out his own burner phone. He dialed the one number he had memorized. Vane? Ilara's voice was strained, breathless over the sound of wind and splashing water. We're at the buoy. The children are safe. Leo is, he's humming, Vane. He's humming the frequency. A lump formed in Vane's throat, but his eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. Keep going, Ilara. Don't look back. Head for the coordinates I gave you in the northern harbor. There's a contact there who will get you across the water. What about you? She asked, her voice dropping. The valley is crawling with drones. I'm finishing the song, Vane said. I'm taking the cameras away from Silas. Once it's done, I'll find you. Look for the signal on the local maritime frequency. Vane, wait. I love them, Ilara, he interrupted, the words feeling like a confession. And I trust you. Keep them safe. He ended the call before she could respond, afraid that her voice would weaken the iron resolve he needed for what came next. He slammed the SUV into gear and tore away from the clearing, the vehicle kicking up a cloud of ash and dirt. As he sped toward the city, Vane watched the sunrise in his rearview mirror. For years, he had been a man who looked at the world through a lens, detached and suspicious. Now, he was driving into the heart of the storm, no longer a voyeur of his own life, but the hammer that was about to break the glass. The city skyline appeared on the horizon, a forest of steel and light. High above it all sat the Airy, the glass-walled penthouse where Silas Thorne watched his kingdom. Vane gripped the steering wheel, his blue eyes reflecting the growing light. Silas had spent 3 years watching Vane through cameras, but he had never seen the man who was currently coming for him. The drive into the city felt like descending into a crumbling simulation. As Vane tore down the motorway, his radio scanned the emergency frequencies. The chaos was absolute. The Red Winter data dump had triggered a domino effect. Warrants were being issued, accounts were being frozen, and the name, Silas Thorne, was being shouted by every news anchor from London to New York. Vane had effectively turned the world's cameras into a spotlight, and Silas was trapped in its center. He reached the base of the Thorne Plaza, a shimmering needle of glass and ego, just as the first police cordons began to form. Vane didn't slow down. He drove the armored SUV over the curb, smashing through the reinforced lobby doors in a rain of safety glass. The security guards, men he had once vetted and paid, scrambled back. Some recognized him and lowered their weapons in shock, others were too busy trying to delete their own digital footprints to care. Vane stepped out of the wreckage, the architect's radio in his hand. Ground floor clear, he barked into the radio, mimicking the tactical tone of the cleaners. Moving to the express lift. Lock down the area. He entered the elevator, his reflection in the mirrored walls a testament to the night's toll. He was covered in soot, salt, and blood, but his eyes were the clearest they had been in years. He pulled the manual override key, a piece of hardware only a Thorne possessed, and jammed it into the slot. The lift surged upward, a silent bullet toward the penthouse. The doors opened to a world of terrifying silence. The area was a masterpiece of minimalist luxury, but now it looked like a tomb. Papers were scattered across the marble floor, and the wall of 100 monitors, the nerve center Silas used to oversee the empire, was flickering with error messages. Silas Thorne stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city he had tried to steal. He didn't turn around when Vane entered. "You were always the sentimental one, Vane," Silas said, his voice smooth and devoid of remorse. "Elena, the children, you let them become anchors. I tried to cut the rope to let you float, to make you the king you were meant to be. You killed my wife, Silas," Vane said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. He didn't raise his gun. He walked toward his uncle, his footsteps echoing on the marble. "You watched her die through a lens you installed in my car." Silas finally turned. He looked old, his face pale under the harsh glow of the failing monitors. "I gave you the world, and you've chosen to burn it for the sake of 2 broken children who can't even speak their own names." "They spoke today," Vane said, a cold smile touching his lips. "They spoke because someone finally stopped watching them and started listening. That's something you'll never understand, Silas. You spent so much time looking at the world through glass that you forgot how it feels to bleed." A distant roar filled the air. The helipad. Silas's extraction team was hovering just above the roof. "The police are 10 floors down, Silas," Vane said, stepping into the older man's personal space. "The Morettas are at the back entrance. And the world knows everything. There's nowhere to go where a camera won't find you." Silas looked at the monitors, then at the gun in Vane's hand. For the first time, a flicker of genuine fear crossed his face. "What do you want, Vane? Money? The keys to the offshore accounts? I can give you everything." Vane reached out and grabbed Silas by the collar, dragging him toward the wall of monitors. He slammed Silas's face against the screens, the glass cracking under the impact. "I don't want your money," Vane hissed into his ear. "I want you to watch." Vane forced Silas to look at the center screen. It wasn't a news feed or a stock ticker. It was a grainy, low-light feed from the northern harbor, the maritime frequency Vane had told Alara to use. In the tiny, flickering frame, he could see a small boat cutting through the waves. And there, standing at the stern, was Leo. The boy was looking back at the city, his hand raised in a small, steady wave. He was safe. He was free. "That's the only camera that matters, Silas," Vane said. He let go of his uncle. Silas slumped to the floor, a broken old man surrounded by the digital ghosts of his greed. Vane didn't pull the trigger. He didn't need to. He could hear the heavy boots of the tactical teams breaching the penthouse doors. Vane walked toward the window, looking out at the horizon where the sun was fully risen. He pulled his own phone from his pocket and dropped it into the decorative reflecting pool in the center of the room. He watched it sink, the screen flickering once before going dark. As the police swarmed the room, shouting orders and pinning Silas to the floor, Vane Thorne simply walked toward the service stairs. No one stopped him. In the chaos and the smoke, he was just another shadow. He had finished the song. He had broken the glass. And somewhere across the water, the mother's frequency was waiting for him. The city behind Vane was a dying star, a sprawling grid of lights and sirens that felt increasingly like a memory. He moved through the service tunnels of Thorne Plaza with the practiced anonymity of a man who had designed them. He had shed the soot-stained tactical vest, replacing it with a discarded maintenance jacket. To the police units rushing upward, he was just another panicked employee fleeing the collapse of an empire. To the world, Vane Thorne had vanished into the very data he had unleashed. He emerged 3 blocks away, in a derelict parking garage where he had stashed a nondescript motorcycle weeks ago, a contingency plan he'd forgotten he'd made. The engine kicked to life with a low, guttural growl. As he tore through the backstreets toward the coastal highway, the wind whipped against his face, stinging and cold. It felt like the first real thing he had felt in years. He didn't look back at the towers. He looked toward the sea. The northern harbor. 40 miles north, the air was thick with the smell of diesel and salt. The harbor was a labyrinth of rusting trawlers and shipping containers, a place where things went to be forgotten. Elara sat in the cabin of the Selkie, a weathered fishing vessel that looked like it had survived a dozen storms it should have lost. Leo and Mia were huddled together on a bench, wrapped in heavy wool blankets. The cabin was dim, lit only by the green glow of the radar screen and a single swinging lantern. "Is he coming?" Mia's voice was a tiny thread of sound, barely audible over the hum of the engine. Elara looked at the child, her heart breaking and mending all at once. Mia hadn't spoken since the night of the Red Winter. To hear her voice now, in this cold, vibrating space, was a miracle that felt heavier than the danger chasing them. "He's coming, Mia," Elara promised, though she felt the cold knot of uncertainty in her stomach. "Your father is a man who knows how to find his way through the dark." She checked the maritime radio. The frequency was silent, save for the static of the open sea. She had followed Vane's instructions to the letter, but the agency's reach was long. Even now, she could see the distant sweep of a high-powered spotlight from a coastal patrol boat. Silas's empire might be falling, but the ghosts he had employed were creatures of habit, and their habit was the kill. The intersection. Vane pushed the motorcycle to its limit, the needle hovering near 120 miles per hour. The coastal road was a ribbon of black silk draped over the cliffs. He was 10 miles from the harbor when he saw them, 2 black sedans with tinted windows, idling at the crossroads. They weren't police. They didn't have sirens. They were sitting low on their suspensions, weighted down by armor and men who didn't exist on any payroll. They pulled out the moment he passed. Vane didn't accelerate, he leaned into a sharp turn that led toward the old pier. He knew he couldn't outrun them on a straightaway, but he could outthink them in the narrows. He led them through a series of tight, gravity-defying maneuvers along the cliff's edge, the sea boiling hundreds of feet below. He reached the harbor's perimeter fence, skidding the bike horizontally and sliding under the gap of a half-raised security gate. The sedan slammed into the gate, the screech of metal on metal echoing through the docks. Vane dumped the bike behind a stack of lobster pots and sprinted toward Pier 9. "Elara," he shouted into his handheld radio. The signal. Now. From the dark water, the Selkie's horn let out 3 short, sharp blasts. A flare ignited, a brilliant crimson flower blooming against the gray dawn sky. Vane reached the end of the pier just as the first of the pursuers rounded the corner. He didn't stop to aim. He dove into the freezing water, the shock of it stealing his breath. He swam with a desperate, lung-bursting strength, his eyes fixed on the silhouette of the boat moving away from the dock. A hand reached out from the darkness. Vane. Elara hauled him over the gunwale, her strength surprising him even now. He collapsed onto the deck, gasping, salt water stinging his eyes. He felt small hands on his back. Leo and Mia were there, their faces pale but their eyes bright with a recognition that surpassed words. "We're clear," Elara whispered, her hand lingering on his shoulder. "The harbor mouth is open." Vane stood up, shaking the water from his hair. He looked back at the pier, where the black sedans had come to a halt. Men stood on the edge, their silhouettes framed by the rising sun, watching the Selkie disappear into the mist. They didn't fire. They knew the game was over. The data Vane had released had made them radioactive. To fire now would be to sign their own death warrants in the eyes of a world that was finally watching back. The open sea. As the Selkie hit the swells of the open Atlantic, the engine's rhythm settled into a steady, comforting thrum. Vane sat on the deck with his children, the four of them forming a circle of warmth against the biting wind. Leo reached out and took Vane's hand. The boy wasn't tapping a frequency anymore. He was just holding on. "Where are we going?" Leo asked. Vane looked at Elara, who was standing at the helm, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the blue of the sea met the gold of the sky. "To a place without cameras, Leo," Vane said, his voice thick with a peace he had never known. "To a place where we can hear the music." Elara began to hum, the true mother's frequency. It wasn't a weapon of the state or a tactical stabilizer anymore. It was a lullaby. Vane joined in, his voice no longer rough with command, but soft with the promise of a father who had finally come home. The boat sailed into the light, a tiny speck of defiance on a vast, indifferent ocean. The glass was broken, the Empire was ash, but for the first time in his life, Vane Thorn was exactly where he was supposed to be. The Selkie was a speck of rust on an endless sheet of iron-gray water. Behind them, the coast of England had dissolved into the mist, and with it, the identity of Vane Thorn. Inside the cramped, salt-crusted cabin, Vane sat hunched over a portable shortwave radio. He wasn't looking for news, he was listening for the chatter. In the world of high-level espionage and organized crime, a vacuum is never silent. It screams. "The London markets are in a tailspin," Vane muttered, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. Thorn Holdings dropped 40% in 2 hours. The board of directors has issued a disavowal of Silas. They're trying to cut the limb off before the gangrene reaches the heart. Elara handed him a mug of bitter, steaming coffee. She had spent the last hour cleaning a graze on her arm where a shard of concrete had caught her in the infirmary. "They can cut all they want. The data you released didn't just target Silas. It targeted the middlemen, the politicians, the bank managers, the port authorities who looked the other way for decades. You didn't just kill a king, Vane. You burned the kingdom." "Good," Vane said, his voice a low rasp. He looked over at the sleeping berths. Leo and Mia were finally out, their breathing synchronized in a way that had become their own private language. For the first time, they weren't hooked up to monitors. There were no wires, no sensors, no blue light. Just the rhythmic creak of the hull. "What happens when we hit the mainland?" Elara asked, leaning against the chart table. "The agency doesn't just forget. They have ghost protocols for assets like us. Even without Silas's money, there are men who will hunt us simply because we know how the clock is built." "We aren't going to the mainland," Vane said. He stood up and unrolled a tattered nautical chart, pointing to a tiny cluster of islands far to the north, near the edge of the territorial waters. "There's a research station here. It was abandoned in the 90s when the permafrost started shifting. It's lead shielded, off the satellite grids, and owned by a shell company I liquidated 5 years ago. On paper, those islands don't exist. Ilara looked at the coordinates. It'll be cold. Isolated. We'll be living like survivalists. It's better than living like targets, Vane replied. Suddenly, the radio emitted a high-pitched, rhythmic tone. It wasn't static. It was a coded burst. Vane froze, his hand hovering over the dial. ... Dash. That's an agency recall signal, Ilara whispered, her face going pale. They're pinging every active and dormant tracker in this sector. Vane looked at the children, then at his own hands. He realized with a jolt of horror that while he had destroyed the cameras and the monitors, he hadn't accounted for the most basic element of the agency's control. The braces, Vane said, his voice trembling. He lunged for the sleeping berths. He pulled back the blankets, looking at the lightweight, titanium alloy braces on Leo and Mia's legs, the ones designed by the specialists Silas had recommended after the crash. He grabbed a screwdriver from the ship's tool kit and pried at the heel of Leo's left brace. With a sharp crack, the casing popped open. Nestled inside the reinforced frame was a tiny, glowing LED, a subdermal resonance tracker. It didn't use GPS, it used the very mother's frequency they had been humming to communicate with the agency's nearest listening post. They aren't just tracking us, Vane realized, the betrayal hitting him anew. The frequency, it was never just for healing. It was a homing beacon. Silas didn't want them to speak because their voices would interfere with the signal. The boat's radar chirped. A high-speed contact was closing in from the east. It was moving at 40 knots, far faster than any fishing trawler or patrol boat. They're here, Ilara said, reaching for her tactical knife. Vane looked at the tracker in his hand, then at the vast, dark ocean outside. He had a choice: he could run and be found, or he could stay and fight the ghosts of his own making. Take the helm, Ilara, Vane commanded, his eyes turning back into the cold flint of the Kingpin. We're going to give them a ghost they can't catch. The pursuit boat was a sleek, matte black interceptor, a ghost vessel designed for quiet, high-speed extractions. It cut through the swells with a lethal grace, its searchlights dead, its crew operating entirely on thermal optics. Vane stood on the stern of the Selkie, holding the 2 titanium braces he had stripped from his children. He had wrapped them in a heavy fishing net weighted with lead sinkers. They're coming in on the starboard side. Ilara shouted from the cabin. Hold the course. Vane yelled back. He didn't drop the braces into the water. Instead, he tied them to a floating buoy and attached a small, timed incendiary device he had fashioned from the ship's flare kit. He lowered the buoy into the water, letting it drift away from the Selkie into a patch of heavy kelp. Now. Cut the engines. Vane hissed. The Selkie's engine sputtered and died. The boat drifted in the silence, its lights extinguished. Vane crawled back into the cabin, pulling the children onto the floorboards and covering them with a heavy, oil-scented tarp. Shoo, he whispered into the dark. Just the song now. Only the song in your heads. The interceptor slowed as it approached the buoy. On their thermal scanners, the heat from the incendiary device and the resonance from the trackers made it look like the Selkie was sitting dead in the water, huddled in the kelp. The interceptor moved in, its crew preparing to board. Boom. The flare ignited the fuel vapors Vane had bled into the buoy. A brilliant flash of white magnesium light blinded the interceptor's thermal optics. In that second of digital blindness, the agency operatives were vulnerable. Vane didn't use a gun. He knew that any muzzle flash would give away their true position. Instead, he utilized the Selkie's industrial winch. He had rigged a heavy steel cable to the mast, and as the interceptor pulled alongside the ghost buoy, he released the tension. The steel cable whipped across the water like a giant scythe. It caught the interceptor's communications array, tearing the mast clean off the deck and dragging the sleek boat into a violent tilt. Go! Vane roared. Ilara slammed the Selkie into gear. The old engine groaned, then roared to life. They surged forward, the heavy wooden hull of the fishing boat slamming into the side of the interceptor, pushing it further into the kelp and the wreckage. By the time the agency crew recovered their vision and stabilized their vessel, the Selkie was gone, lost in the heavy fog and the spray of the North Sea. Vane sat on the floor of the cabin, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached out and felt the children's legs, now free of the metal, free of the trackers. They were shivering, but they were safe. "They'll send another," Alara said, her hands shaking on the wheel. "Let them," Vane replied. "We're out of the frequency now. We're in the deep water." He looked at the radar. The interceptor was a stationary dot on the screen, crippled and blind. Vane reached out and turned the radar off. He didn't need to see the world anymore. He just needed to feel the boat moving forward. As the sun began to rise over the northern horizon, Vane Thorne finally did something he hadn't done in 10 years. He leaned his head back against the wood and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, guarded by a woman he had once suspected and children who were finally learning to walk on their own. The transition from the open sea to the Arctic fringe was a descent into a world of monochrome. The North Sea's vibrant blues had been replaced by a slate-gray sky that met a churning, white-capped ocean. The Selkie groaned, its wooden bones protesting the drop in temperature as the salt spray began to freeze into crystalline jagged edges along the gunnels. Vane stood on the deck, his hands encased in heavy, oil-stained gloves. He was no longer the manicured kingpin of Thorn Plaza, he was a man carved out of granite and survival. The loss of the leg braces had been a psychological turning point. Without the metal support, Leo and Mia had to rely on their own strength, and more importantly, on each other. Inside the cabin, Alara was teaching them how to move. It wasn't a physical therapy session, it was a lesson in balance. "The boat is your body," Alara's voice drifted out to Vane, low and steady. "When the waves pull left, you lean right. You don't fight the ocean, you join it." Vane watched through the salt-streaked glass. Mia was standing, her small hands gripping the edge of the chart table. Her legs were shaking, the muscles atrophied from years of forced stillness, but her eyes were locked on Alara with a fierce, burning focus. Leo stood behind her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, not to push, but to steady. They were a closed circuit, a private engine of resilience. "They're getting stronger," Vane said as Alara stepped out onto the deck to join him. "The mind was always there, Vane. It was the frequency that was keeping them in the cage," she replied, pulling her collar up against the biting wind. "But we're running out of fuel. And the Ghost interceptor wasn't the only one out there. The agency doesn't send one boat to catch a shark." Vane checked the manual compass. They were nearing the blind spot, the coordinates of the abandoned research station. "If we can make the cove by nightfall, the ice shelf will provide enough cover to mask our thermal signature. But we have to cross the Siren's Gate first." The Siren's Gate was a narrow passage between two towering sea stacks, notorious for its unpredictable currents and a constant, low-frequency hum caused by the wind rushing through the hollowed-out rock. To the agency's acoustic sensors, it was a nightmare of white noise. To Vane, it was a sanctuary. As the Selkie entered the Narrows, the humming began. It was the mother's frequency, amplified by nature. The vibration was so intense it rattled the fillings in Vane's teeth. In the cabin, the children didn't flinch. They closed their eyes, their expressions peaceful, as if the earth itself were singing them to sleep. Suddenly, the radar, which Vane had pulsed for a split second, lit up like a Christmas tree. "3 contacts," Vane hissed. "Closing from the rear." "They aren't boats, Alara. They're drones." The agency had deployed Harpy units, low-altitude, silent flight drones equipped with magnetic anomaly detectors. They didn't need to see the Selkie, they just needed to feel the iron of its engine. "Get them to the hull," Vane commanded. "If the drones pass directly over us, the metal of the boat might blend into the mineral deposits of the sea stacks, but only if we're stationary." Alara didn't argue. She ushered the children into the bilge, the lowest, coldest part of the boat, wrapping them in lead-lined emergency blankets she had salvaged from the infirmary. Vane killed the engine. The silence that followed was terrifying. The Selkie drifted, bobbing like a cork in the shadows of the massive stone pillars. Above them, the faint, insect-like whirring of the drones grew louder. A searchlight cut through the fog, a cold, clinical finger of light searching for a ghost. Vane held his breath, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. He looked up through the hatch. A drone hovered directly above, its sensor array rotating. He could see the red eye of its camera, the same eye that had watched his life for 3 years. He felt a small hand slip into his. It was Leo. The boy had crawled out of the bilge and was standing beside him in the dark. Leo didn't look afraid. He looked at the drone, then at Vane, and then he did something Vane would never forget. Leo opened his mouth and began to hum. It wasn't a random sound. It was a counter-frequency, a sharp, discordant note that mimicked the wind in the rocks. Vane felt the vibration move through his own body. Above them, the drone's red eye began to flicker. The interference from the sea stacks, combined with the boy's precision, was overloading the drone's proximity sensors. The drone drifted, confused, then veered sharply into the rock wall of the sea stack, exploding in a silent puff of sparks and plastic. The other 2 drones, sensing the loss of their lead unit, circled once and then retreated toward the open sea, their logic circuits concluding that the Siren's Gate had claimed another victim. Vane looked at his son in the darkness. The silence returned, but it was filled with a new kind of power. "You did it," Vane whispered. "No," Leo said, his voice clearer than it had been since the crash. "We did." As the Selkie drifted out of the Narrows and toward the hidden island, Vane Thorne realized he wasn't just escaping his past. He was building a future with a boy who had learned to fight the machines with a song. The Selkie finally struck land not with a crash, but with a weary, grinding slide onto the black volcanic sands of the hidden island. The research station, dubbed the Vault in Vane's old ledgers, loomed above them, a brutalist slab of concrete and rusted steel half swallowed by an encroaching glacier. Vane was the first over the side, his boots splashing into the icy surf. He didn't look for enemies, he looked for the environment. The air was so cold it felt like inhaling needles, but the island's natural geothermal vents sent plumes of steam rising from the cracks in the earth, creating a permanent, low-lying fog that obscured the shoreline. "Elara, move them to the primary bulkhead," Vane ordered, his voice echoing against the cliffs. The geothermal heaters should still be operational on the emergency backup. He carried the children one by one across the black sand. Leo and Mia were wide awake now, their senses heightened by the strange, prehistoric landscape. As they entered the station, the heavy blast doors groaned shut behind them, sealing them in a tomb of lead and concrete. Inside, the station was a frozen time capsule. Old magnetic tapes lined the walls, and the air held the metallic tang of long-dead machinery. "We have power," Elara called out from the control room. A dim, amber light flickered to life, revealing a space designed for total isolation. "Vane, this isn't just a research station. Look at these consoles." Vane walked over, his brow furrowed. The monitors didn't show weather patterns or ice depths. They showed global communication nodes, the shadow net that existed beneath the public internet. This was Silas's failsafe, Vane realized, his hand hovering over a dusty keyboard. If the Thorn Empire ever fell, he planned to come here to rebuild it from the ruins. He didn't just want to hide, he wanted to reboot the world's surveillance from a place no one could reach. As Vane began to scan the directories, he found a folder titled Lullaby. He opened it, and his heart nearly stopped. It was a video file, timestamped 3 years ago, just days before the crash. On the screen, his wife, Rachel, was sitting in a lab. She looked tired, but her eyes were defiant. She was speaking to someone off camera, Silas. "I won't do it, Silas," Rachel's voice rang out, clear and steady. "The frequency isn't for tracking. It's for neuroregeneration. If you use it to slave their neural pathways to your network, you aren't protecting them, you're lobotomizing them. I'd rather they never speak again than have their thoughts owned by you. Vane felt the world tilt. The mother's frequency wasn't something Rachel had collaborated on, it was something she had died to protect. Silas hadn't just wanted to kill a successor, he had wanted to turn Vane's children into the ultimate, organic processing units for his surveillance state. Vane, Alara's voice was a sharp whisper. She was looking at the perimeter monitors. On the black and white screen, the fog outside the station was being pushed aside by the downdraft of a heavy-lift helicopter. It wasn't an agency drone. It was a private, unmarked gunship. "He's here," Vane said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute, murderous calm. "He didn't go to the helipad to escape the police. He went to his private transport. He knew exactly where I would go." Silas Thorne hadn't come to negotiate. He had come to reclaim his hardware. "Alara, take the children to the sub-level 4, the core. It's the only place shielded enough to block the neural override signal he's going to broadcast," Vane instructed. He reached into a locker and pulled out a heavy, industrial-grade flare gun and a tactical shotgun he'd stashed there years ago. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her eyes searching his. Vane looked at the monitor, where the silhouette of his uncle stepped off the helicopter, flanked by a dozen elite mercenaries. "I'm going to finish the conversation my wife started," Vane said. "I'm going to delete the network." Vane stood at the heavy reinforced glass of the observation deck, watching the mercenaries fan out across the black sand. They moved with the cold, synchronized lethality of machines. At their center, Silas Thorne walked slowly, leaning on a silver-headed cane, looking less like a fugitive and more like a king inspecting a new province. "Silas doesn't want me," Vane whispered, his breath fogging the glass. "He wants the prototype." He turned to the main console. He didn't have much time. He began slaving the station's geothermal pressure valves to the central security computer. If he couldn't hold the station, he would vent the volcanic steam into the corridors, turning the bunker into a pressure cooker. "Vane, the children are secured," Alara's voice crackled over the internal comms. "But the broadcast has started. I can hear it in the walls." A low, subsonic hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't the soothing resonance of the mother's frequency, it was a distorted, jagged version, a digital serrated edge. In the sublevel, Leo and Mia began to clasp their ears, their bodies tensing as the signal tried to force a handshake with the dormant neural pathways Rachel had once tried to heal. "He's trying to pulse them," Vane hissed. He grabbed the shotgun and a satchel of high-yield mining explosives. He stepped out of the control room and into the main corridor, just as the outer blast doors were breached with a deafening thermite charge. Silas stepped through the smoke, his eyes scanning the dark hall until they landed on Vane. "You've grown quite a spine, Vane," Silas said, his voice amplified by the station's own speakers. "But you're playing at a game you don't understand. Those children aren't just your blood, they are the architecture of the next century. Their brains can process a billion streams of data simultaneously without the lag of silicon. They are the ultimate observers." "They're human beings, Silas," Vane replied, leveling his weapon. "And they're done being watched." "Are they?" Silas smiled, a cold, thin line. He pressed a button on a handheld remote. The subsonic hum shifted into a high-pitched scream. From the sublevels, Vane heard a sound that tore his heart out. Leo and Mia were screaming in perfect, terrifying unison. The signal was overriding their nervous systems, turning their own bodies into a battlefield. "I can stop the pain, Vane," Silas said. "Just step aside. Let me take them to a proper facility. I'll give them the world. You can even watch, from a distance. Isn't that what you're good at?" Vane looked at the explosives in his hand, then at the geothermal pressure gauges on the wall. The needles were deep in the red. "I'm not a watcher anymore, Silas," Vane said. He didn't fire at Silas. He fired at the primary geothermal manifold directly above his uncle's head. The pipe shattered, releasing a pressurized blast of superheated volcanic steam. The white cloud swallowed Silas and his mercenaries in an instant. Vane didn't wait to hear the screams. He sprinted toward the sublevels, his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached the core, slamming the manual lock. Inside, Elara was holding both children, her own face contorted in pain from the frequency. Vane lunged for the main power breaker, the one that fed the station's massive broadcast antenna. "If I pull this, the station goes dark forever," Vane shouted over the roar of the steam and the high-pitched signal. "We'll be trapped here until the ice moves." "Pull it," Elara cried. "Pull it and end it." Vane gripped the heavy iron lever. He looked at Leo, who was staring at him through the pane, his eyes pleading for the silence. Vane pulled. The world went black. The screaming signal died instantly. The lights, the monitors, the trackers, everything that had defined Vane Thorne's life for 3 years vanished into a profound, absolute silence. Outside, the steam cleared to reveal a silent, empty corridor. Silas Thorne and his dream of a digital godhood were gone, buried under the weight of the mountain and the fog. Vane sat on the floor in the dark, feeling the small, steady breathing of his children in the stillness. There were no more cameras. No more frequencies. Just the 4 of them, a mile beneath the ice, finally, truly, alone. The silence in the sublevel core was heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and the cooling of massive iron conductors. For several minutes, none of them moved. Vane sat with his back against the dead breaker panel, his lungs burning from the exertion. He could no longer hear the hum of the world. No cooling fans, no server drones, no digital heartbeat. Slowly, Leo and Mia uncurled from Elara's embrace. The tension had left their bodies, replaced by a profound, limp exhaustion. Leo looked up at the ceiling, his eyes searching for a flicker of red light that was no longer there. He let out a long, shaky breath, the first breath of a boy who was finally the sole owner of his own mind. "It's over," Vane whispered, his voice sounding foreign in the absolute stillness. "The antenna is dead. The shadow net is severed. The ascent." They climbed the emergency stairs toward the surface. The station was a tomb of shadows, illuminated only by the pale, ethereal glow of the aurora borealis leaking through the high observation ports. Vane kept his shotgun leveled, but there were no more mercenaries. The steam manifold burst had done its work. The main corridor was a twisted mess of scalded metal and silence. Silas was gone, consumed by the very geothermal power he had sought to harness. When they stepped out onto the black volcanic sands, the Arctic dawn was breaking. The sky was a bruised palette of violet and deep orange. The Selkie sat perched on the shoreline, encased in a thin layer of rime ice, looking like a ghost ship. "We can't stay here," Elara said, her breath blossoming in the freezing air. "The agency will eventually send a physical recovery team when the satellite heartbeat doesn't return." "They can send whoever they want," Vane said, looking at the horizon. "By the time they get here, there won't be a thorn left to find." The final signal. Vane returned to the Selkie and retrieved a small, manual telegraph key, the only piece of technology he hadn't destroyed. He wired it to a localized burst transmitter. He didn't send data. He didn't send a location. He sent a single, ancient nautical code, "End of watch." It was the signal he had prepared for himself years ago. It told his offshore executors to trigger the final liquidation of his remaining assets, distributing the billions of the Thorn Empire into thousands of untraceable charities and local accounts across the globe. He didn't just delete his family, he deleted the prize they were fought over. 1 year later, the sound of the sea. The island of Inismeen was a rugged slab of rock off the coast of Ireland, where the wind spoke louder than any man. In a small, whitewashed cottage overlooking the Atlantic, a man sat on the porch mending a fishing net. His hands were calloused, his skin bronzed by the salt air, and his blue eyes were calm. A young boy, Leo, sat beside him, carefully threading a needle. He didn't need a frequency to focus. He was watching the way the thread moved, his brow furrowed in concentration. From inside the cottage, the sound of a piano drifted out. It was a simple, haunting melody played by Mia. Her fingers, once stiff and locked, moved across the keys with a delicate, newfound freedom. Beside her, Alara sang, not the mother's frequency, but a local folk song about the sea. Leo looked up at Vane and smiled. It wasn't a signal. It wasn't a handshake. It was just a boy happy to be with his father. "Dad," Leo said, his voice steady and clear. "The tide is coming in." Vane Thorne stood up and looked out at the vast, empty horizon. There were no cameras here. No monitors. No ghosts. "I know, Leo," Vane replied, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "I can hear it." The kingpin of London was dead. The master of the shadow net was gone. But as the sun set over the wild Atlantic, Vane Thorne finally realized that he had never been more powerful than he was in this moment, standing in the wind, listening to the world with his own ears, and watching his children grow in the beautiful, unrecorded light. The cameras showed Vane Thorne everything, but they couldn't show him the heart of the woman he hired. Alara didn't just clean his house, she cleaned his soul. If you were shocked by her secret past, make sure to check out our other stories of hidden identities and ultimate redemptions right. The end.